back to the DTVC Extra podcast. As always, this is Matt here. And yeah, we're getting started here on the first three Rambo movies, which of course the first movie wasn't a Rambo movie. It was called First Blood. But either way, right? I think when I first started the DTVC Extra, this was back in 2023 when I had this idea that I wanted to make the podcast weekly, but didn't quite have the guests to do a weekly show. So it was like every other week we'd have a guest, and in the weeks we didn't have a guest, I'd do the DTVC Extra. And I wanted to look at franchises that I don't always often look at on the DTVC Connoisseur. And, the first one, of course, was the Fast and Furious ones. But, Rambo was one that I'd been wanting to do. It just seemed to be perfect for the show, but it wasn't available. And one of the interesting things is that I discovered that Paramount actually owns the TV rights to at least the first three Rambo movies. So the fact that it wasn't available on Paramount Plus was a little bit puzzling, but it is there now. I watched these first three on Paramount Plus, and then Tubi has the other two. So Tubi has the new one, the 2008 one and the 2019 one. So I'll try to get those watched as soon as I can on Tubi and make that happen. But I was excited to see that these were here on Paramount. So really excited to get in on these. We're going to do the 380s ones today, and then we'll do the new ones in 2 weeks' time. So I was trying to think where to start here. I mean, I think one of the things is, of course, taking us back to 1982, which I barely remember 1982. I was born in 1979, so of course I was 3 at that time. I existed. My parents will tell me about things that happened in 1982 that I did, but I don't remember them. I know some people have memories from earlier times, but my earliest memories are about 4. So it would have been like 1983. I think the biggest one is with Star Wars Return of the Jedi. I remember a neighbor up the street had a lunchbox for Return of the Jedi, and we traded when I went to nursery school. He was a year or two older than me, so he was already in like elementary school or something like that, and we traded for the day. So that's a 4-year-old memory that I have there. So anyway, so let's get in 1982. So a few things about 1982 that make this first film we're going to talk about, First Blood, unique. Or at least it makes it a different time than what we're used to now, what we understand the world to be now in 2024. And the first one is to do with Stallone specifically. So Stallone had major success, right, with Rocky and Rocky II, but he really wasn't finding any success outside of the Rocky films. And he was looking for something to be that vehicle of success, for something beyond the Rocky movies. And to be honest, I don't know that he saw Rambo as it, because the original cut of Rambo was 3.5 hours long, and he said it was so bad that he tried to buy the negative so he could destroy it. So we almost didn't have Rambo, but he does. They end up cutting it down to I think there was like a 40-minute version that was used to kind of make international sales, and he really liked that version, and then they got it down to 93 minutes, which is the version that we know of today. And he really likes that version. That's the version that's become a classic. That's the version that we know that kind of started the whole Rambo thing. So that's one piece of it. Is that I don't think he thought Rambo was going to be the thing. Rambo is the thing, right? Rambo is the one that makes him that international star that he is for the 80s. When Rambo comes out in 82, it actually outperforms Rocky III. And then I believe First Blood Part 2 also outperforms Rocky IV. They're kind of like both right next to each other in the top 10 for the gross for that year. So, I mean, anytime an actor has 2 top 10 grossing films for the year, they're certified a big star. And so Rambo's the one that does that for him, but I don't think at the time he would have expected that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is this idea that Rambo, as a Vietnam vet, would walk into a town and be treated, hostilely by the police department there, by the townsfolk there, that people wouldn't have wanted to see, that a veteran would be treated that poorly. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, too, that this is not the environment we think of today. We think of kind of during, after 9/11, but really kind of more as we were going into the Iraq War. There's sort of the sort of rah-rah, thank you for your service approach to veterans and to people who've served in the military. Which I think is better. I think it's good that we do that now. I mean, 1982, you would not see, sporting events here in America, there's always a part during the game where they salute a local, service member who, and they may not have served in combat. They may just be active duty. But they'll salute them, and then everybody will stand up and cheer for them. I think the cheering for most of the people that are doing the cheering, it's more for themselves than it is for the actual service member. They want to kind of show how patriotic they are. But regardless of that, I think especially for Vietnam veterans who were not welcomed back to the United States, or were not treated well when they came back here, at least for a large part. I mean, there are some segments of the veteran population from Vietnam. I think, for example, pilots, right? Pilots did really well. Vietnam vet pilots, they became commercial airline pilots in kind of like that last gasp of the golden age of aviation here in America, and so they made out well. I know a friend of mine's dad was a Vietnam War vet pilot who was a commercial pilot in the 80s and 90s and made a really good living doing that. So that was one segment. For the most part, though, Vietnam veterans, you kind of the way Rambo is when he walks into the town and he's walking on a highway that really isn't supposed to have pedestrians, and he's got his army coat on and his long hair. Today, right? If somebody saw a veteran walking, in their army fatigues, in their with their coat and whatever, and they were walking along a highway, someone would stop and ask them for a ride, ask if they needed a ride. But that wasn't the case here, and I think that is an important distinction, right? That kind of post 9/11, post that period, the treatment of veterans has changed here. I think it's for the better overall. I mean, there's still some aspects. I mean, you saw with Jon Stewart where he was trying to get benefits for veterans who had been exposed to toxic chemicals, and it was hard to get those through. So I think sometimes people are, it's easier for people to cheer at a game when a veteran is shown on the screen and they can stand up and be like, look at me standing up here. I'm such a patriot. But then, when it comes to actual like in voting in politicians that do things legislatively that actually, do some really positive good for veterans, or if they see a veteran on the street, right, they're, step over them. They're not going to be standing up and cheering and be like, hey, and also too, I think like if a veteran was like, maybe you had a trans veteran, right, or if Pete Buttigieg, right, is a gay man maybe with his husband and kids. If they showed him, I don't know if you'd get a standing ovation from those same people that are doing the standing ovations. But the point is that yes, Vietnam vets in particular, I think, especially after 9/11, I know that talking to some, obviously I'm a lot younger, but they were like my dad's age and older. But there's kind of a feeling like, okay, hey, we're finally getting appreciated here. Some also were kind of like whatever. It's just it's part of this sort of this war machine that was going on at the time. Because if you think about that period, after 9/11. When troops were deployed to Afghanistan, that was kind of understood like, there was a whole international contingent that was there. The Iraq War was something different, right? That was something that not everybody was in favor of, but it was also kind of used. Part of the way that it was framed here in America was along that sort of rah, thank you for your service thing, so that it was like if you came out against the war, it was like framed as, well, you're not supporting the troops if you're against the war in Iraq. And it made it hard for a lot of politicians. That was one reason why Obama had an easier time getting elected in 2008 over, say, like a Hillary Clinton or some of the other Democratic opponents, was that he wasn't in office at the time of the Iraq War, so he wasn't forced to support it in that way. So there are other elements to it as well. But just to keep in mind, Rambo in this movie in 1982, he would have been seen very differently than he would have today, right? And I think overall it's a good thing that people that have served are better respected than they were at that time. So that's another piece there. The third piece is Brian Dennehy's character. In the novel, so the novel that this was based on was written in 1972, and the issue that Brian Dennehy's character in that novel, he's the sheriff, of course, in the town. The issue he has with Rambo is that there's a sense that he was a Korean War vet, and the Korean War, the Korean War was almost like a forgotten war at that time, and all the emphasis was put on Vietnam, and then of course World War II vets at that time. They were the ones who were kind of the adults who were working in all the business positions and all of that. You think like Mad Men brings this up a bit, right? Because John Hamm's character, Don Draper, he was a Korean War vet, and like Roger Slattery, right? His character was a World War II vet, and there's sort of like this sort of joking but not joking kind of thing of like, hey, we were in a real war, you weren't. The thing is that 1972, yes, the Korean War would have been seen as the forgotten war, but by 1982, of course, MASH had come out, and MASH brought the Korean War back into the forefront of people's minds, so that 1982, a sheriff who fought in the Korean War wouldn't be angry at a Vietnam vet for saying like, oh, people are caring about your war, they don't care about mine. In fact, I do think that a Korean War vet probably would have had more. Would have maybe been more sympathetic. Even a sheriff would have been more sympathetic to a Vietnam War vet at that time. So the Rambo takes that the movie kind of takes that piece out. Like there is when he goes into his office, when Dennehy goes into his office, you see some of his medals and things like that, but they don't really bring up the Korean War that way because it's not a piece of the story as much. So it's an interesting facet of this though that by 1982 the Korean War had gained more prominence through MASH. It's an interesting thing too because you think about MASH. MASH was like a commentary on the Vietnam War. So there's also that piece as well that, again, when the novel was written in 1972, that element wouldn't have been there. Similar to, like, remember the Battlestar Galactica remake in the 2000s was a commentary on the Iraq War and some of the things that were happening there. Just MASH did a better job of it, right? I think even the people who made Battlestar Galactica would say that, yeah, that MASH did a better job. So there's that there as well. But yeah, I mean, I'll get it a little bit in the movie because I haven't seen this one in forever. This one would have been a movie loft movie for me. When I say a movie loft movie, I mean in the 80s and 90s on WSBK 38 in Boston, they had a show called The Movie Loft with this gravelly voiced host Dana Hersey. It kind of had this like loft apartment set. And he would have a movie. He would show a movie on nights that there weren't any Bruins games or Red Sox games because WSBK had the Red Sox and the Bruins. So if they didn't have any games on, they would show things. And a lot of the movies that I saw, that's where I saw them, was on the Movie Loft. And so they would do classics, like they would do Casablanca. Remember Gone with the Wind was a 2-night affair because it was so long. But also a lot of movies from the 80s, especially the early 80s, those ended up on the Movie Loft. So I think like the Blues Brothers, I first saw that one on the Movie Loft. Running Scared, right? I think it was Running Scared. That's the one with Gregory Hines and Billy Crystal. I think that whatever that movie was called, I first saw that one on the Movie Loft. A lot of movies. Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th. I would have seen those on the Movie Loft as well. There was another independent channel in Boston, WLVI 56. They also had some of those, so sometimes you'd see those on those nights. It was that time with these independent channels where they would show movies, but Rambo, First Blood, we would call it instead of calling it Rambo. That's something that I would have seen on the Movie Loft. And I would imagine when I probably would have seen it would have probably been around the time the third one came out in 88. That's probably when they would have showed it because a lot of times they would go based on certain themes. Like, oh, this movie's in the theater, let's do, like, for example, Terminator. I saw Terminator on there, and I believe they aired it when the sequel came out, when Terminator 2 came out. I believe that's when they aired the first Terminator. So a lot of movies that I saw growing up, a huge piece of where my love of movies comes from was the Movie Loft. But that's where I would have seen this movie the first time. And it's probably been I probably haven't seen it since then. So we're talking about a good 35 years since I've last seen First Blood. There are elements that I didn't remember, but I remember the basic gist of him being in the force and all of that. I will say one of the things, recently we covered Deadly Prey with Todd Liebenow from Forgotten Filmcast, and I was saying how I thought that movie was a little bit more self-aware than we give it credit for. I think seeing Rambo, I can see it more as a parody of Rambo. It's just not such an overt parody of Rambo, but it's a parody. I think we treat it as like a samurai cop or like The Room or something like that. I don't think so. I think I'm beginning to see now that it was goofy on purpose. And like, for example, when Rambo kills the wild boar, right? He's just sort of snacking on wild boar. The whole eating the worm and eating the rats and stuff like that was, I can see it now more as a spoof of that. So that's an interesting piece of it is that, I saw Deadly Prey however many years after I saw Rambo that I'd forgotten pieces of that. Like, I think I'd forgotten the wild boar thing. Those were some of the things I forgot. But yeah, seeing it again, I think it's obviously 35 years is a long time to go without seeing a movie. So this is probably a movie that you'd see more often. But there are a few elements of this movie, I think, that make it, I don't want to say less rewatchable. It's not an action movie in the way that we understand action movies today. And part of that, I think, is just because in 1982, we didn't make action movies the way we do now. And, part of that was we didn't quite get the influence from, say, like Spielberg and Lucas, who, they inverted the action drama ratio in movies, right? That, like, think of like a movie like Indiana Jones, where it used to be that you'd go like 45 minutes with drama and build up and all that, and then a huge action piece, and then go another 45 minutes. They inverted it where it was like, I won't say 45 minutes of action, but you'd go like 25 minutes of action, a 5-minute break, and then you'd go through another period like that. And that's kind of how we expect action movies to go now. Like if an action movie goes more than 15 minutes without an action sequence, it can be hard to handle. And this movie definitely feels of its time in that sense. This is definitely before that. And when we get into the later Rambo movies, it definitely feels more like a modern action film in that sense. It's almost like Stallone when he takes the franchise over after this film, he makes it into more of that kind of thing. The way he plays Rambo, he's almost like this mild-mannered, almost childlike character. And he said he wanted to give him a childlike quality. And he brings it in the very first scene with how awkward he is talking to his old army buddies. We don't know if it's the wife or the mother that he's going to see, but he's going to see him and finds out that, no, he died of cancer that he got through Agent Orange, which I know... my dad's best friend, who passed away, he didn't die of that, but he fought in Vietnam. He talked. Everybody's telling us at a party about a letter he got from the government, like, you probably should get yourself checked out just in case you got it. So so it's again, very real thing that I think Stallone. I think one of the things about this movie is that Stallone, I think, wanted to bring real issues that Vietnam vets were going through into the film. He at the end of the movie, when his character has the breakdown, he's bringing up stories that Vietnam vets told him about their experience over there. So he wanted to kind of bring that in. So he brings that in that opening sequence, but also kind of the childlike and sort of awkward way that he can't get the pictures out of his or the notebook out of his jacket and that kind of thing. And then, the walking on the highway, such a really fantastic scene. I mean, it's a very American scene, right? We just have so many roads that people just can't walk on, right? I take it for granted here in Philadelphia, as someone who doesn't drive or anything like that sidewalks are everywhere. Sometimes I have to go out to the suburbs or something, and it's like, oh, where am I supposed to get the bus on this grassy hill because there's no sidewalk for me to stand on when I wait for the bus. That's kind of experience for a lot of people, and so he's not getting a ride or anything like that. He's just walking on this highway that's not meant for a pedestrian. This very short shoulder, but he's just going for it. Then he gets picked up by Brian Dennehy. And we get that juxtaposition where we know right away that Brian Dennehy, he's picking him up because he's trying to get rid of him. He's trying to strong arm him, and he does, And the way that Stallone plays that Rambo character while he's opposite him in the car, he's like, well, I want to get something to eat. Well, there's a place 30 miles up the road you can get a place. Why can't I eat here? What's wrong with that? And so he drops him off at the edge of town, and Stallone just walks back into the town, and so Dennehy arrests him, and then. We get the incident in the prison where they're mistreating him. He finally snaps. He has some PTSD. They trigger the PTSD in him, and he snaps and he attacks him. Steals a dirt bike, then goes into the woods, and he's sort of there in the woods, and he's able to fend them off and fight them off. So then they call him the National Guard, but also Troutman, right? Richard Crenna. Is it Richard or Robert Crenna? I think it's it's a Crenna of some sort, right? Sorry, I just kind of reached over to get my IMDb because I'm always bad with names, so I can't. I always have that, but I always love the it's Richard Crenna. Yes, it is Richard Crenna. I was right the first time. But anyway, what was I going to say? But yeah, I mean, recently when I was doing my review on Alien Love, I was saying how I got Computer Love by Zapp in my head, and that's the Troutman brothers, right, who were in there. So seeing Colonel Troutman, Crenna playing Colonel Troutman just made me think of Zapp, right, and their electronic funk music from the late 70s, early 80s, which would have been right around the same time, right, as this movie comes out. But anyway. I think there's a few things about this movie as we kind of, as we get into that period where he's fighting off the National Guard and the Army and everything. Sorry, not the Army, the police. One is, most of the time when a character has a bad interaction with a police officer, it's a corrupt police officer, right? And these police officers aren't corrupt, right? They're not. There's no grift going on with them. They're not breaking the law. They're just mistreating a prisoner, which is it's a more common thing than we realize. I mean, I think just the power dynamic of being a police officer, it attracts certain individuals who aren't always, well off mentally. It's part of the problem with the concept of policing, right? Is that you get some people that are trying to help and want to protect and serve, but you also get people who like the power. I mean, I remember when I was doing driver's ed, we had a police officer talking to us, and we asked him, why did you want to be a police officer? He said, well, it's the power. So yeah, so no compunction about that we had that there. He thought it was perfectly fine to tell us that he would, usually I think we always assume that police officers would have the canned story of I wanted to serve my community, I wanted to do right by people, I wanted to help people. And the fact that he didn't, he didn't even sugarcoat. He's like, yeah, I wanted the power. It was a little bit of a wake up call for high school Matt and growing up in the suburbs in America. But anyway, but I think it's important with these. These are not corrupt cops here, right? In fact, they think that Rambo is a vagrant, and they have every right to mistreat him while they have him in their custody, in a way to almost like feel like they're teaching him a lesson. But they feel perfectly okay with that. Later action movies, when they have bad cops, right, they don't depict them this way. They're generally involved with the mob, some kind of corruption or grift. They're committing crimes, and they're kind of full on baddies, right? These guys are they're baddies in the movie sense, but they're depicted in a different way here. And I think it's interesting how they're just normal cops here that are just bad. And the other thing too, I guess, is that the novel, Rambo's the bad guy, right? Rambo is taking out innocent police officers and he's killing them. In this movie, right, he doesn't kill any of the cops. He shows Dennehy, I could have killed these guys. The only one that he kills, he actually doesn't kill him, right? It's the kind of the worst of the bad cops. He's shooting at Rambo from a helicopter. The helicopter pilot's telling him this is a dangerous situation. Rambo eventually throws a rock at the helicopter to get them to get away, and the guy falls to his death, and Rambo scoops up his gun and gets some other things there. But it is just the idea that the police are the bad guys in this, and they're not corrupt cops. They're just police officers being police officers, and they're the baddies. And I think that was an interesting take there. Rambo talked about the fact that, Stallone talked about the fact that Rambo is sort of this Frankenstein monster that's created by Troutman. And there's definitely a feel of that here as well. When you think of the original Frankenstein movie where he kills the girl, which is a trip, right? Have you seen that? I don't know if you've seen that Frankenstein in a long time, the one from the 30s, where he just takes the girl and just throws her in the water. It's just like such a trip. But anyway, there's a bit of that in here where Troutman's like, I created this Frankenstein's monster. I'm going to try to bring him in while the townspeople are there with their pitchforks. Instead of their pitchforks and their torches, right? They've got machine guns. They've got M16s. But it's a similar idea. And I think that's a really great piece in this as well. Again, it's a theme that we don't really have in the later ones, but I think that's a great piece here. And then when Rambo escapes and he goes into the town and he's starting to blow things up and everything, and finally Troutman gets to him and starts to talk to him, and he has that breakdown scene. I mean, that's just an absolutely fantastic scene. It's the kind of thing we don't see from Stallone much as an actor. He starts to kind of go into these more like alpha male tough guy roles. And I think that's the thing about Rambo in this film, is that he's not your standard alpha man tough guy, right? He has all the qualities that people who want to be alpha men would want, right? The special forces training, the ability to take out 5 people at once, the fact that he can live off the land and he can, do all of these kinds of things, right? Like if I was a man, if I was going to turn this podcast, I'm not going to, but I would turn it into a manfluencer kind of thing, right? I would probably stolen valor a Rambo idea, say that I served in the Navy SEALs and all this stuff, and after I make a few $100,000 of people donating stuff to me, then somebody calls me out and says, hey, he never served, he never did anything like that. But you'd base it off of that, right? If you were going to try to do a manfluence grift, you'd make yourself Rambo, and I think a lot of them do, right? But Stallone depicts it in this way that's like, yeah, everybody would want to think this guy's the big alpha male, but he's hurting inside. He's dealing with a lot of things. The reality of actually killing human beings, unless you have something off with you, you're sort of a sociopath. Generally, the idea of killing another human being is not a fun thing. It's not something that people enjoy. But also, not only is he dealing with the killing that he had to go through in Vietnam of killing other people, but also, being a prisoner of war and being tortured, seeing friends die. I mean, that's another piece of it, right? And he talked about, talking to other Vietnam vets and them telling those stories, sort of the survivor's guilt of like, why did the missile land 20 feet away and kill my buddy and not kill me? Some of those kinds of things. And the way he depicts that, especially with that breakdown at the end, was just absolutely fantastic. Again, it adds a level to this as an action movie that we don't get anywhere else. So there's a lot of little pieces like that in here that make this thing something more than just an action movie. But ultimately, it's the sort of the forerunner of what we expect or understand action to be, right? This is one of those movies that's sort of the seminal movie that plays a part in getting us to where we are with action now. There's pieces in here that you can tell, like that. In the later movies are fully fleshed out. Like, for example, the helicopter sequence. When Stallone throws the rock and the helicopter's windshield gets damaged, the helicopter just flies away, right? Yes, the guy falls down, he falls to his death out of the helicopter, but the helicopter itself flies away, and then Dennehy's like, we need the helicopter back, and one of his deputies is like, well, he doesn't want to come back, right? He doesn't want to deal with Rambo anymore. In the later movies, of course, those helicopters get blown up. And in action movies, really, since then, helicopters blow up, But at that time, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a helicopter had to blow up. They treated it a little bit more realistically there. So on the one hand, while you're getting some standards that we expect from action movies, like the blood squibs, the shooting and all of that kind of stuff, we're also getting some of the things that we expect from an action movie aren't quite there yet, which I thought was kind of fun to see here. I mean, again, we go longer periods without action in this. There's not constant... there's the shootings, there's the action sequences, but there's also periods of things happening where, it's just Rambo sort of trying to find his way through the cave and dealing with rats. Which apparently the rat sequence, they had a complaint lodged against them because those rats were not well treated. Interesting thing with rats is that they, for humans, right? Obviously, our nearest ancestors are, primates, right? Like chimpanzees. I think we share like 97% of our DNA with chimpanzees. Gorillas. All the different primates. But our next ancestors group would be like rats. Like that's kind of the next one we're closest to. And it is interesting. We think of them as being these rodents that I don't know what I would do if I ever saw a rat in our apartment. I would probably freak out. It wouldn't be a fun thing to see. But they do have a lot of different qualities. I know, I think like snakes. People have pet snakes. I think they sometimes feed them like baby mice or baby rats. And there was a woman who said she was at a pet store one time who was like a veterinarian, and she knows that like rats and their kids, rats like have a longer period of time where they're taking care of their young, almost not to the level that humans do, but maybe more than like say like for example like a cat with their kittens. And so to take baby rats away from the rat mother that soon would be very difficult for both of them. So yeah, so it's not like rats are like these insects or something that like, yeah, if they're on Stallone's back and he's like grabbing them and throwing them around and stuff like that like, yeah, they were seriously hurting them there. And so somebody did file a complaint against that. And I think, now, of course, he said he wanted to kill the boar. And they were like, you can't kill a boar. Like, I think it would probably kill you. I think he wanted to actually kill other animals too. And they were finally like, no, you're not killing any animals here, Mr. Stallone. That's not going to happen. But you get some of those sequences there that nowadays, right, you'd probably be having more pitched battles and more action sequences in the middle there. But again, Stallone does such a great job playing the Rambo character, and then the supporting characters are so solid that you can go longer periods without action sequences. And then when you get the action sequences, they don't have to be as great as what we see nowadays. We get some big explosions here, but we don't have everything as quite to the level, right, that you would... that you see nowadays, right? That we're going to see in the next two movies, right? Where we're going to get huge explosions and huge action sequences. Where in the second, First Blood Part 2, one of the stunt coordinator or one of the special effects coordinators dies, right, trying to rig one of the explosives. So that's the kind of stuff that we get as we start to kind of up the ante there. One of the things I read was that Brian Dennehy didn't want to play that part, and they actually had to offer him more money. They had to offer him more money a couple times to finally get him to do it, and I totally get why. It's not a fun character to play. It's one thing when you're playing Alan Rickman as a baddie, or like some of these diabolical Russian baddies, right, that we get in these later Rambo films in the 80s, or whoever it is, Schwarzenegger said he wanted to play the Terminator in the first Terminator, not be the hero, because he really liked that baddie. Like, those are fun baddies, right? They're fun, diabolical baddies. Dennehy is just a heel, right? He's just a shitty guy. He's just a shitty sheriff who, by dint of the way our society works, he has gotten a large amount of power, more than he really deserves to have, and he's hired a shitty staff of just shitty human beings with him that treat people like shit. And it's not a fun character to be. It's interesting because he plays the scariest character I've ever seen, right? I don't know if it's a character, but, when he plays John Wayne Gacy, that's the scariest role I've ever seen. That movie's the scariest movie. I think it was called, like, Murder in a Small Town or something. I can't remember what it's called. It had some kind of name like that, but... That John Wayne Gacy biopic, to me, that's still the scariest movie ever, and his depiction of John Wayne Gacy is the reason why. So he's a scary guy. I mean, he's scary in Gladiator as the baddie in that as well. This is kind of a different kind of scary because it's scary in the sense that, like when he's harassing Rambo, when he's harassing Stallone, and he's like, frisking him and giving him a hard, putting his getting ready to arrest him and all of that, right? Like, that's scary because it's real, right? Like, there are real Brian Dennehy character out there, in towns right now that, like, that you don't want to deal with, that you could find yourself in trouble if you're dealing with, because they have an outsized amount of power. Now, granted, if it was me and not Rambo, if I find myself in a situation where I'm wandering through a town and Brian Dennehy picks me up and says, I'm going to let you off on the other side of town and then you can figure out food after that, I'm probably not going to turn around and walk back into the town, right? I'm not going to push Brian Dennehy at all. That's my thing, because I don't need that. I don't need any of that. But by the same token, it doesn't give Brian Dennehy's character license to be the way he is, or any of the other deputies under him. So I can get why Dennehy wouldn't want to play that part. By the same token, he plays it so well that it makes the movie even better, right? The fact that he's doing that, especially when it's juxtaposed with Krenna's Troutman, that just really works as well too. So we're hitting the 30-minute mark here. I think it's probably good for us to maybe take a break here and then get into First Blood Part 2. But yeah, a couple other things before we wrap up. I think one of my favorite parts is the Yacht Rock song that we have in the closing credits. So it's Marty and David Paich. I think it's Paich or Paich. I can't remember. But Marty Paich, of course, jazz musician born in the 20s. But his son David formed Toto with some other sons of jazz musicians in the LA area. And so they made the music, and then Dan Hill sang the end song. So Dan Hill, of course, the Sometimes When We Touch guy, right? So real yacht rock pedigree here between Toto and Dan Hill in here. Wondering what yacht rock is. I've kind of thought of myself like, well, how does it differ from actual soft rock? It's sort of like a subgenre of soft rock that takes place kind of in the 70s into the early 80s. But the term yacht rock I saw on a MTV documentary. I guess it came from these two guys that did like this web series of sort of joke parodies of the soft rock singers like Kenny Loggins, Michael McDonald, Hall & Oates, those kinds of guys. And they came up with this concept of yacht rock, which of course they didn't copyright, so now everybody's using the term. But it's kind of this subset of soft rock that kind of, probably like 70s into I think it maybe starts as early as maybe like David Gates with Bread and maybe Seals and Crofts and those guys, and then kind of goes into like the early 80s. I mean, I think, Air Supply would fit into that category, some of those guys. But I mean, definitely Dan Hill's Sometimes When We Touch. Like, that is a clear yacht rock song. Africa by Toto, Rosanna, Hold the Line, those all kind of fit too. I mean, the other thing too about Toto, with those guys being sons of jazz musicians, I mean, the musicianship in Toto is just next level. And that was kind of a hallmark of a lot of those yacht rockers, is that you get you think of like a group like Ambrosia as well. I mean, David Pack ends up he was like the musical coordinator for Clinton's 2 inaugurations. Another great musician. That they would kind of layer these sounds and do it in this way that you just don't see sort of, rock to that point, right? It was just, very simple kind of stuff. I mean, yes, you had the Beatles where they were great writers, but it generally was just, right, a lead guitarist, a bassist, a drummer, and a singer, and maybe a keyboardist, right? You'd throw that in there. But with this yacht rock stuff, I mean, this was kind of like the next level of it. And yeah, the Toto guys, and, Dan Hill, I mean, Dan Hill's, Sometimes When We Touch, that was a huge hit. It's just kind of fun, 1982, to have a yacht rock song at the end of an action movie. Just something that I thought was beautiful. So, yeah, maybe that's a good place for us to leave this. I was trying to think if I had anything else beyond that to talk about. I think the other thing, too, of course, is just the legacy of this movie. It creates an action hero in Rambo that just has entered the zeitgeist and lexicon in a way that, I mean, Rocky's a similar thing. I mean, Stallone has 2 characters like that, right? He's got Rocky, who, every time you go to a sport, I'm talking about sporting events here, every time you go to a sporting event, you hear the kind of the Rocky theme at the end. If the team that you're the home team is down, they'll play that music to be like, oh, especially here in Philly, right? I mean, Philly has like this really great history of actual athletes, and instead they've got a statue of Rocky, right? I mean, I think Joe Louis is from here, great boxer, one of the greatest boxers of all time, or Joe Frazier. I mean, there's some great boxers. I think Bernard Hopkins is from here as well. Yeah, I mean, it's really actual fighters, right? But they've got like Stallone and Rocky, the statue for that, here in Philly. So it just kind of shows you though, like how big of a character that is. Rambo's close to that level, right? I mean, if you say Rambo, if it's a term that you use, right, for somebody who's like overly militant, right? What are you going to do there, Rambo? What are you doing with that? It is a concept there. Also, too, I mean, the fact that this character in this first movie, which is a very strong rated R movie with adult themes and all of that, the fact that that leads to a set of action figures and a cartoon later in the 80s, I think is another fantastic thing, too. So Stallone has really built something here. I mean, he's essentially got Rocky, and now a second major character that's just a major force in pop culture, major influence on our lexicon, the way we speak, and things like that. That he's done that twice now, and that you can use Rambo, you can use elements of Rambo, and people know exactly what you're talking about when you do that. Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing that he's done that twice here now. So that's kind of his legacy, and that's the legacy of this movie here. But yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll take a break here, and then we'll shift gears and start looking at First Blood Part 2.
The war on drugs is raging, and Detective John Bainbridge is the LAPD's secret weapon against crime. Former Special Forces in Nam, he's a cop on the edge. When he and his partner Geary uncover a potential human trafficking ring, it doesn't take long before John Bainbridge realizes this thing goes all the way to the top, which doesn't scare him. That just means they'll fall that much harder when he takes them down. Part send-up and part love letter to early 90s action films, Bainbridge will take you back to the golden days of Canon, PM Entertainment, and AIP. You can get it in paperback or on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited from Amazon. Follow the link in the podcast description.
Extra podcast here. So we're going to get into Rambo First Blood Part 2 here in just a second. But one thing I wanted to correct from the previous segment, I said Joe Louis is from Philly. He's not. So Joe Louis, originally from Alabama, moved to Detroit. But Joe Frazier, originally from South Carolina, did move to Philadelphia, where he started his boxing career here. And then, of course, Bernard Hopkins, definitely from Philadelphia. So at least those two, Hopkins and Frazier, are probably more deserving of a statue than Rocky, who didn't actually box in Philadelphia. But hey, it's Philadelphia. We have the Rocky statue, but not actual boxers that actually got punched in the face for a living, and definitely punched in the face as well. But yeah, but I wanted to say that because I anybody, especially listeners from Michigan, who might be wondering, hey, you're saying Joe Louis is from Philly? No, he's not. He's from Detroit. So yeah, got that out of the way there. But yeah, looking at this movie here, so 3 years after the first one comes out, Stallone was kind of shopping around the sequel. He originally went to Canon and gave them this idea of wanting to use POWs missing in action, and Rambo goes to save them. The Canon guys looked at that and said, a little too rich for our blood. I don't know if, one, we can afford Stallone, or two, if we can afford the production that you want to do here. So later on we'll get back to you, and we'll make Over the Top, because arm wrestling is a little bit cheaper to make than this movie. But he ends up working on getting it made. But at the same time, Canon liked the idea of this movie, so they decided, let's do it on the cheap. And so they do it with Chuck Norris, who's a cheaper star, lower production values, and that's where we get Missing in Action. That's why those two movies are pretty similar, coming out in 84 and 85. And I guess, what was it? They filmed the two of them back to back and decided that it was the second one that was more like Rambo that was the better of the two. And so they decided to go with that one first, the second of the two movies. But anyway, so that's where you get that similarity there. Essentially, Stallone gave them the idea when he pitched the idea to them, and they just used it and made a cheaper version. But this version that Stallone gets made here, it's about $10 million more than the first one. So it's about $25 million. I think the first one was $20 million to make, or sorry, $15 million to make. It is, as successful as the previous one. You could talk a little bit about the whole Missing in Action thing. That was, something that had been largely debunked around this time, that there were still prisoners of war being held in Vietnam, up to 15 years after the war ended. The problem is that we do have so many soldiers that, nobody knows exactly what happened to them. So a lot of family members sort of holding out hope that maybe our loved ones may come home at some point. And, it's possible they still could have. I mean, you think of a movie like White Tiger, right, where William Katt's character just sort of disappears and kind of lives off the land. And maybe you could have had some that went AWOL. But I think for the most part, right, it's not wanting to give false hope to family members that their loved ones who went missing in action might someday return. But I think it's a difficult thing, right? When you have loved ones who you don't know what happened to them when they go off to Vietnam or go to war in another place. To not know what happened to them is got to be a difficult thing. And I think there was some criticism of this movie and the Braddock missing in action, that they were sort of playing on those emotions there, making this movie because of course, right, they find the prisoners of war, right? Rambo finds the prisoner of war in Vietnam and he tries to rescue them, or he does rescue them, right? He brings them home, and when Troutman says, "Hey, you're going to get another Medal of Honor for this," he's like, "Give it to those guys; they deserve it more," which is true, right? I mean, if you do 15 years in a prisoner of war camp, I think you probably do deserve the Medal of Honor much more than the guy who busts you out. But anyway, this movie does, similar to the previous one, I think it's the number 2 grossing film of 85 after Back to the Future. It does edge out Rocky IV, so it's the second time that Stallone's Rambo movie edged out his Rocky movie. But the other thing is that, he said that he thought this movie was more cartoonish, and that's why he didn't like it as much as the previous one. I agree with that. I think the first Rambo was a better movie than this, but this movie's a more fun actioner. I don't know how many times I saw this one as a kid. So I would have been 6 when it came out. At that point, Rambo was everything, right? He'd become this huge deal in the zeitgeist. I would say, a few years after that, especially when number 3 comes out in 88, this movie's on TV a lot. I had friends that had it on VHS. I don't know how many times I've seen it. It's been a long time since I've seen it recently. It's probably been maybe another 30 years since I've seen this one. Maybe mid-90s, so yeah, but close to 30 years since I'd seen this one. So it's not like I'm watching these a lot. That was part of the reason why I wanted to cover these for the podcast, is that it had been a while since I'd seen them. But this was one that, would be on a lot. The scene where he's lowered into that mud and pig slop thing or whatever, he's got the leeches on him and stuff like that. I don't know how many times, scenes like that I'd seen. George Chung getting blown up with the explosive tipped arrow, right? Just blowing everything up, right? With the explosive tipped arrows, except for a helicopter. He does that in the next movie, but doesn't do it in this one here. So all really interesting stuff. I think, as I got into doing the direct-to-video connoisseur and started doing, especially a lot of the Philippine, the Vietnam War movies that were shot in the Philippines in the late 80s, you could see how much is borrowed from this movie. I don't know if you can hear the sirens going by there. Corman's police are coming to stop me from talking about his Philippine war movies, or the Italian directors. Guys like Bruno Mattei, right? They were just making Rambo, First Blood Part 2 over and over again. They're using guys like Reb Brown and Brent Huff and whoever. Vic Diaz was your baddie, right? He's the one who's torturing them. They always had as the guys that come up, it's called the prerequisite torture scene, right? Or a gratuitous torture, right? Something like that, But they always had that, right? Because this movie has the torture sequence, so that's in there. The huts blowing up all over the place. Common thing that you see here in this movie. I was trying to think of some of the other ones. The boats, right? Obviously you got to blow up the boat. I think with the practical effects here, one of the technical effects guys dies in this movie. So I think it's one of the things, we look at movies today where they use a lot of computer effects to do things, whereas this movie's using a lot of practical effects. I guess, it looks better with the practical effects, but it's also more dangerous, right? And so, you think of guys like the AIP guys, or like, again, some of these Italian directors in the Philippines, someone like maybe Cirio H. Santiago, who did some of these movies. It can be a little scary, right? Thinking of them rigging up explosions and that kind of thing, blowing up huts and stuff like that. If a movie like this could, have somebody die in it, those would definitely be a little bit even rougher there. The other thing, of course, is that there's the theme of the guy who's used by his country. And, so America as this entity that sort of churns out soldiers, and he used the expression expendable when he's talking to Julia Nixon on the boat, saying that, he's expendable to, his country sees him as an expendable asset. As part of the reason why they sent him into this mission is so that, if he does find POWs, he can, they can kill him off, right? Because he ends up getting sold out by Charles Napier. So So but you get those some of those themes there. So it's a little different, right, from the first movie, which was like the Frankenstein's monster concept, where Troutman creates this killing this soldier who is now society's turned on, and he tries to save him. This is different, right? This is the army creating these soldiers almost as these disposable assets that they can send wherever they need to. If they die, they die, no big deal. If they need to disavow knowledge of them, they can. It doesn't matter. They're property essentially. And I mean that's technically what you are, right? When you are a soldier in the military, you are property of the United States. That's why there's certain things like I think my friend was saying his dad before his dad went to Vietnam, he got a really bad sunburn. And like I guess when they had shore leave in Hawaii or the coast in California, but he got a really bad sunburn, and I think it was almost severe enough that he was potentially in trouble with being court-martialed because eventually he was damaging government property in a sense by hurting himself like that. I think it ended up not being so severe that he was okay, but I guess there was a risk of him getting in trouble for that. And so they kind of play some of those elements up here a bit. Of course this is 85. If that was Iran-Contra, I feel like that was right around that time, and so this idea that there are these government guys that are doing these hokey things, in different parts of the world. It's an interesting thing because we swap out Brian Dennehy for Charles Napier here, and Napier is great in that role as the smarmy government guy who's sending troops into places and doesn't care if they die or not, right? Abort the mission, pull out. Oh, the helicopter's just about to save Rambo. No, pull the helicopter out, just leave him there. That Napes likes that kind of. He can pull that kind of thing off. It's interesting too because I think Napes, he's someone that whereas Dennehy was like he didn't want to do the role unless he got paid more money. Napes is someone who's like a professional actor and he'll do it. I don't care if the guy's smarmy, I'll do the role. Give me the paycheck, let me do it. I'll do it as smarmy as you need. The end when Rambo confronts him and his like shirt is like all soaked and he's just like, I'm just following orders, and Rambo, of course, he throws the knife into the table. It's like, I'll come back for you if you don't, if there's more of these guys, I'll come back for you or whatever. It was, because again, I think it's one of the great things about the way Rambo is played by Stallone is that he doesn't kill people that are unarmed or people that are innocent. He's only killing other soldiers that could take him down. And so, he's not going to kill an unarmed guy despite the fact that maybe he's despicable enough to potentially, I don't know if deserve it is the right word, but these are things that in later action movies, I think, what you would do, right? What you would do now, I think, is Napes would have a gun near him, and when Stallone turns his back, he'd pull the gun, and Stallone would turn around and throw a knife at him or something like that. And so that's the way you deal with killing him off, because it really isn't a good thing, right, for the hero to be killing an unarmed guy, especially an older guy like Napes there. But yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'm realizing like I'm only like 10 minutes in here. And I feel like I've covered kind of everything because that's the thing about this movie is that it's so much fun and has so many big action pieces. There's the one where he's on the boat and another gunship is floating into a flaming gunship is floating into that boat. So he's got to jump off before it explodes and it just looks great. Again, when he has all the explosive tipped arrows, just a ton of fun where he's just blowing things up all over the place. When he blows up George Chung, that's a lot of fun too. Martin Cove and Napier, they kind of fill out the cast in a really fun way. Julian Nixon. The Julian Nixon thing, I was trying to think if that trope of the sort of the, I don't want to say exotic beauty, that's the expression that would be used. That was considered an okay expression back then, but now we look at that and we know it's not a good thing to be saying. But there was always that concept, right, in these movies that there would be this actor who would, I guess, was local to the area. So, she would be, a person of color. Julia Nixon's from Singapore, but she's going to play the Vietnamese woman. She would have a thing for the hero. They would hook up. Of course, in this case, she gets killed. But, a lot of times, they would hook up. This happens a lot in these movies. And not just in these movies, but just in movies in general, when the character is in either the Philippines or Hawaii, Mexico, South America. There's always going to be that kind of that element there. Interesting when you think of the first Blood Fist movie, right? Because Don the Dragon Wilson, who is part Asian, he's hooking up with a white woman, and that kind of is what happens in those Blood Fist movies. And I don't know if that's part of it. It's like, oh well, I guess if he's Asian, he can't hook up with other Asian women. I'm trying to think of DeCascos if it's the same thing when he's in these movies. I think he does. I think he was so but yeah, like his wife Julie Conda, he meets her in Crying Freeman, right? So. Yeah, I never thought of that, how that trope works in reverse, right? That if the actor is Asian, it has to be a white woman. I guess it doesn't have to be, right? I mean, if the movie takes place in Hong Kong, right, they not necessarily. But what I was trying to think of was did this trope exist before Rambo, before First Blood Part 2? Like, were there other movies where the main character is meeting this woman, local woman? I guess in the 70s you would see it probably in some of those movies. But yeah, I kind of feel like it's kind of it starts here. I mean, there's so many elements of this Rambo movie that just get copied in these other films later, and that's one of them. Again, the exploding huts, that's another one. The one-man army piece where he's going in and taking guys out, that's another piece that we see a lot. One of the things that's interesting is we get George Chung here, and then, of course, we get Steven Berkoff, who I found a recent upcoming episode of the podcast. Actually, it's going to go on Tuesday. We have Will from Exploding Helicopter on, where we're talking about Craig Fairbrass movies. We talked about Dead Cert that had Steven Berkoff, and he was telling me that one of the things that Berkoff does is he would do these big screen movies here and take the money from those to fund his ability to do these like outlandish, like aggressive theatrical performances, which I think is a really interesting thing that they would be doing that with him. So he's in this as the Russian. I'd heard that actually Stallone was considering Dolph Lundgren for the Russian in Berkoff's role, but then when he realized, when having him in Rocky IV, he figured better to have him in Rocky IV than in this movie. I guess there was a sense you couldn't have him in both, which would have been interesting, right? It would have been like Double Impact and Bloodsport, right? That you've got Bolo Young and Van Damme in two different movies. That I guess, especially if you had them in the same year. I guess that's the thing, right? Is that this movie for kind of, Stallone kind of takes this thing over and he makes it into this action franchise. But it's also interesting because this, franchises in the 80s, we've talked about this with the Die Hard movies. We talked about with the Star Trek movies that franchises were different at this time. It was definitely a franchise that he's working on that he can keep making movies with, especially with the Rocky movie. I mean, I think he saw maybe he had one more Rocky left that he could do. But Rambo is something he could make more of as well. But even with Rambo, when he does the third Rambo movie, he kind of decides, okay, let's go into other things. But this is the movie here. This First Blood Part 2 is the one that solidifies him as an action star and allows him to do stuff outside of Rambo and Rocky. So then you get Demolition Man. Then you get, Judge Dredd. And it's interesting, too, because he has this window as his major action star. But I was trying to think of what other wins he's had. I mean, I love Cobra. Cobra's a really fun one. Over the Top, I mean, I don't know what we do with Over the Top. That doesn't really make any sense. So I was trying to think of what else after Rambo, because Demolition Man I guess works, right? That one's good enough. But Judge Dredd didn't work. That wasn't a great one. I guess the Specialist, is that what it was? Or Assassins, right? It was Assassins the one that he did with Antonio Banderas, right? And then the Specialist, right? That was one he did with Sharon Stone. So he had some hits. He had some big movies, but Rocky and Rambo, he made something with those two. And I think it's interesting. I think when he gets back into the Expendables, I think he realizes sort of the character-driven element is what really works for him, is building a character and making it into this compelling person that we want to see more of. And I think that's the thing that we get with Rambo is that, after this movie, we want more Rambo, right? We want another film from him. And it's so, it only goes 3 years before we get the next one. So it's another piece of this that I think is important, right? Is that we get that he makes himself into, I want to say, He solidifies this character as his other big one that he can make alongside with Rocky, but he solidifies himself as an action lead. I mean, this is another year that he's got this is actually 2 top 5 movies. I mean, the fact that he's that big and that bankable of a star. But also, I think, too, he starts to get into that pattern where he's overly controlling the movies. He's becoming too big for himself. And I think that's what hurts him as we get into the 90s in a way that it doesn't hurt Schwarzenegger. Right? Schwarzenegger is kind of known as being easy and fun to work with. Whereas Stallone becomes a kind of a hardhead, a kind of a hardo that people don't want to work with as much. That he's too controlling. He takes over the scripts. He changes things too much, and so people don't want to work with him as much. And he doesn't get the big parts in the '90s that Schwarzenegger gets. Here in the 80s, the two of them are neck and neck, I would say, right? That Stallone has created something here with Rambo. He's got the big Rocky movies. Schwarzenegger, with the Terminator, with Predator, with Commando. He's also making a big name for himself. Running Man, right, is another one. So there are two biggest action stars. And of course, when we get into the next film in 1988, we're going to have Die Hard in there as well. So Bruce Willis puts himself in the mix. But I think the one thing, too, that we could say about Stallone with this movie is that he solidifies himself as a big lead, but I think he also, with this movie, at the same time that Schwarzenegger's making his big films, the two of them together are really starting to create the action movie ecosystem that is going to just be so huge when we get in the late 80s into the early 90s. I think the bottom comes out of it in, say, like 94, when we get sort of that independent film explosion. You get movies like Clerks, you get Pulp Fiction, Shawshank, I guess you could throw in there as well. These more indie films that people started to kind of get sick of the big action movie. They weren't as big. And so you get a few kind of last gasps in 94, 95, 96, but the bottom kind of falls out on that big action thing. And Schwarzenegger's probably the one who lasts the longest. He gets into like the early 2000s. But Stallone he's pretty much out of it by the end of the by the end of the 90s. He's kind of he's making stuff that's not that big. I mean, what was the movie he made? Was it Driven, the car racing movie? I think that was like 01. That one doesn't do that well. But yeah, I think he and Schwarzenegger, I think with these movies that they're making here, and I think Rambo is a huge part of creating the action ecosystem that we, someone like myself, grew up in. That made it possible for people like a Van Damme or a Seagal to be making big budget action movies. It made it where studios were trying to find their next, Van Damme and Seagal with guys like Speakman and Thomas Ian Griffith. It made it possible, though, also for this direct-to-video action world where you got PM Entertainment making movies with guys like, Don the Dragon Wilson, Cynthia Rothrock, Gary Daniels, that these names could also be big because the ecosystem was such that you could only have so many in the theater, but yet, companies like HBO, video stores, they needed to fill things. And the desire was such that, or the need was such with Rambo and stuff like that you could make these movies, that you could, that there was money, that Corman could have money in going to the Philippines and having Serio 8 Santiago direct a whole bunch of these movies and just filling the video store shelves with them. That kind of comes here with this Rambo movie. The first Rambo movie, it establishes that Stallone has somebody other than Rocky that he can be bankable with. That's what you get with that first movie. This movie here, though, is one of the major components in establishing the action ecosystem that kind of dominates the next 10 years or so. And it's still a big deal now, but it's a different thing now. Right now, it's more of an adventure ecosystem with guys with like the Marvel movies, Fast and the Furious movies. I think kind of shift into a big adventure process. But the Mission Impossibles, all those kinds of movies, they're all more of an adventure feel to them than a straight ahead action feel. But that's kind of what what's there now. Where straight ahead actioners don't always make the big screen as much. It's more like adventure movies that have action elements, something like Captain America or Winter Soldier. I mean, the John Wick movies, right? Those kind of bring back old-fashioned action and do it in a really great way. The Deadpool movies, I think, have some of that as well. But really, action now doesn't exist in that same format. And of course, direct-to-video action, nowhere near, right? You get some guys like Jesse V. Johnson, Isaac Florentine, James Nunn, who are making stuff, putting some stuff out there that's good. But for the most part, the budgets have been slashed. I mean, the budgets you could get for PM flicks, in terms of just the action elements of it, you couldn't even get a PM budget now. And PM were low budget movies. The budgets that Corman movies got, you don't get those budgets even anymore. Let alone to be able to make some of these other films that So yeah, the ecosystem that they create Rocky here is a huge part of that. So, I think that's kind of everything that I've got here. I'm rambling a little bit as I'm going through here, but again, just a fun action. I mean, I just remember as a kid, friends having this on VHS, it being on HBO, edited versions on TV. This was the one that was the rewatch. This was the one that was on a lot. The first Rambo, First Blood, that one was not on as often as this one was. But this one, it's got everything that you want. This is the one that when people parody action movies, they're parodying Rambo, right? The shirtless guy with the headband and all of that. That's all of it right here. So and when watching it today, it's kind of fun to watch it and see like all of the things that were borrowed from it. But also, it was borrowing things too. Stallone was taking things that were kind of getting to be popular at that time as well, with the one-man army stuff, the massive explosive set pieces and all of that kind of stuff. While this one's on Paramount, it's definitely a fun watch if you haven't seen it in a while. Especially as you're kind of for me, so many low-budget movies that I've seen that copy this one, to kind of come back and watch it again and be like, oh yeah, look at all this fun exploding hot action and all that other stuff that I'm seeing in here. So why don't we take a break here, and then when we come back, we will do the last one. We'll do part 3. We'll finish up
Don's House in the Mountains is available now. It follows Don Veazey, who after 20 years has finally made it as a writer, going from an AP English teacher to richer and more famous than he ever could have imagined. In the process, his wife Lois, feeling alienated and resentful of her husband's success, has filed for divorce, forcing Don to move to a house in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. With time alone to reflect, he's able to see how his new wealth and fame has affected his life in ways he never expected. Maybe the biggest of these is his new house, which is bigger and nicer than anything he's ever had in his entire life, but the longer he lives there, the more he gets the sense that it might have magical powers. But that can't be right. A house can't have magical powers, can it? Pick up Don's House in the Mountains today. You can find it at Amazon.
We're getting ready to finish off this episode by looking at Rambo 3. So this movie comes out in 1988. Interesting stuff happens between 85 and 88. Probably the most interesting is that a Rambo cartoon was released in 1986, which I remember being on TV as a kid. And I was trying to think if I'd seen First Blood Part 2, but not the first film when I'd seen the cartoon. I can't remember. Because like I said, I remember, I'm pretty sure I saw the first movie when the third one came out, when the movie loft played it. But I can't remember. I think I had seen First Blood Part 2 when the cartoon was on. But I mean, the only thing I remember from the cartoon, I remember there was one where he's in the woods and he's like sitting like in the lotus position, and a deer comes up and he's like feeding the deer out of his hand, and then I think Troutman shows up in a helicopter and scares the deer away. That's what I remember from the cartoon. But I think it lasted one season. It was an odd concept. There were a lot of like adult movies, R-rated movies that were turned into cartoons for kids. Beetlejuice was one. That one lasted for a good amount of time, I think even. What were the other one? There's a Chuck Norris Karate Commandos. I think that wasn't necessarily based off anything specific. Ghostbusters TV show, Teen Wolf cartoon. Yeah, all that kind. I mean, the Ghostbusters cartoon. that creates the whole thing with Slimer as like this character that's used in like high C ecto cooler and stuff like that. But also, I remember like the characters like Egon. It's completely different in the cartoon, but that it kind of changed the way that the movies were perceived, and then I think you go back and you kind of remake them. That was a common thing, making these cartoons out of TV shows. Star Trek had a cartoon. So it wasn't like it was a completely odd thing, but it was odd enough. Looking back on it now, it was odd enough. As a 7-year-old, I didn't think it was odd, right? Why would I think it's odd that you made a cartoon out of Rambo? It makes sense to me. But now as an adult, it's like, no, Stallone was right to not be happy that they were doing that. And actually, what Stallone does is he ramps up the violence in his movies going forward, so you can never make a cartoon about them again. I remember in part, and the one after this one we're going to talk about in 2008, I remember he's got like this big machine gun, and like, you just get like these trucks of baddies like showing up, and he's just mowing them down. He was like, yeah, make a cartoon out of this. So but anyways, that happens in between. Some other things to think about as we get into 1988. This movie is based off the the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is something that I studied in school. So in college as undergrad, I studied sort of the Muslim world, some of those elements. In the spring of 2001, I wrote a paper for my class on the Muslim world on the Taliban and women's treatment under the Taliban. Remember, it was like really difficult for me to get books on anything. And then, of course, 9/11 happens, and all those books that I was like going through like interlibrary loan to try to get copies of, shipped up to UMaine to write my paper. Suddenly I go to like the Borders in Bangor, and there's like tons of copies of those books everywhere, which was kind of crazy. But so I'd studied this a bit and kind of understood it. So watching the movie, it's interesting watching this movie and how they depict that conflict compared to sort of what my understanding of it. So to give you a sense of my understanding of it, of course, the Soviet Union, right? There was a communist government that was running Afghanistan, and they get deposed, or they're fear. Or I think there was a coup that takes over, and Soviet Union invades, right? And so they at that time, they were running countries like Uzbekistan. There was called Uzbek SSR, right? Kazakhstan was Kazakh SSR. But those countries that are now independent countries, they were under the Soviet Union at that time. So they kind of invade through there, and in the war, in a sense, it becomes their Vietnam, right? Because it's just this mess for them to. And some people talk about it as being part of the reason why the collapse of the Soviet Union happens. But we've talked about on here before, when I was talking about Reagan, that actually, I think part of the reason why they invade Afghanistan is that they kind of know. I don't know how to explain it. I mean, because Reagan wasn't in office at that time, but I think there was a sense that they knew things were slipping at that point, and invading Afghanistan was sort of like this last gasp of showing their power and showing who they were as a country. But they really didn't have the money for this war. They didn't really have the money to keep propping up the Soviet Union the way they do. Then when Reagan gets into power, there's a sense of like, well, we need to double down on this war. We need to double down on, like hawks in the administration, in the government in the Soviet Union, became more powerful. But by the time this movie comes out, those hawks are pretty much out. And you've got Gorbachev in office now. He's opening the Soviet Union up. He announces, I think 6 months before this film comes out, that troops are getting pulled out of Afghanistan. They're no longer going to be there. So this movie really isn't that timely. And I think that affects the film, right? By having the Russians as the Soviets as the big bad, despite the fact that Gorbachev is kind of, doing this whole glasnost process, and the fact that he's, pulling out troops out of Afghanistan, makes this idea of like the Soviets in Afghanistan not so much the baddie that it should be. Now, another piece that this movie doesn't get into enough, part of the reason why Afghanistan becomes the Soviet Union's Vietnam is because the U.S. government is funneling weapons into to the rebels in those areas. What you get from that is that while this movie has like Troutman is on the ground as the one getting them the Stinger missiles, right? So he's working in a capacity as a member of the American military to get these Stinger missiles to the Afghans so that they can essentially take down the Soviet fighter jets and Soviet helicopters and whatnot that were kind of bombarding the people in Afghanistan. It's a way to sort of turn the tide of the war. So in actuality, it wasn't people like Troutman that were bringing the Stinger missiles. What was happening is that the missiles were getting funneled through the Pakistani ISI, which is their secret service arm, and they were funneling them often to more extreme, fundamentalist Muslim groups, which is what ends up forming the Taliban, is that they were kind of supported by the Pakistani ISI, funded through the Americans, through the United States. It's also where where Al Qaeda comes from, right? Because Osama bin Laden actually leads a group of soldiers, of mujahideen, in battle against the Soviets, and that's part of where he kind of becomes radicalized. In fact, a lot of the terrorists that you think of, at that time, they were either trained by sort of American proxies in the Soviet in Afghanistan, who then took that training, because you would have like for example, like Saudi citizens who would go to Afghanistan to fight, to try to sort of help the Afghan government or the Afghan rebels fight the Soviets. So they would go and get that training, and then they would bring that training back and give it to to terrorist groups. So then you get things like for example the first World Trade Center bombing that happens, or like what was it the Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, that bombing that happens there. But a lot of those are coming from soldiers that were trained in that Afghan war that was funded by the Americans who were trying to fight this proxy to sort of take down the Soviet Union. They had a sense at that time that if they could make Afghanistan the Soviet Union's Vietnam, that could be the thing that topples them. What they didn't know, right, was that Reagan on the other side, being so belligerent in his rhetoric against the Soviet Union, was propping them up. So at the one hand, on the one side, the American government is through this proxy, right? They're funneling all of these weapons, all of this training through the Pakistani ISI into Afghanistan, which again is what gets our creation of the Taliban. They're doing that on the one hand, while on the other hand, Reagan with his rhetoric is taking hawkish elements in the Soviet Union, saying, no, we got to keep fighting, we got to keep doing this. And so, of course, so essentially we just keep training what was going to be our future adversaries in the Taliban. We're training them, the U.S. government's training them because the Soviet Union is not really interested in pulling out while Reagan is agitating against them. So it's a really interesting element that's happening there. But again, by the time this movie is made, Gorbachev has already talked about we're going to be pulling the troops out soon, and I think it's within a couple of years that the last troops head over the border into Uzbekistan, or what was then Uzbek SSR, not long after this film comes out. But anyway, that's some of the background on the movie, some of the geopolitics involved there, that getting a little bit bogged down. And of course, some of the stuff I haven't even thought about in over 20 years. So trying to pull it from memory, from those papers I wrote and the books that I was reading at that time, it does take a lot, kind of trying to do it. But, the legacy, of course, right, was that, you'd have landmines everywhere. There's a movie that I saw recently, I think I was talking about on a different podcast episode called Kandahar, and it was directed by Iranian director Mohsen Makhmalbaf. And for example, there's a scene in that where there's a guy who's missing an arm, and he says it's because of a landmine. But then there's this mindset of well, how would someone who grew up in Afghanistan under the Soviet war would know better than to touch something with his hand? And the inference is that no, it's not that he lost his hand with a landmine, but it's that he stole something and the Taliban cut his hand off as retribution, right, for stealing something. So interesting elements there. I mean, that's a really great movie. If you ever get a chance to see that one, Kandahar, it's really nice. It's a movie that I saw with my friends at the Indie Theater in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a long time ago. But most of Makhmalbaf is a great director anyway. Another movie called Geba that I really liked. He's done some really great stuff. But anyway, getting off track, no need to get into too much on Iranian cinema here. Let's get into Rambo III. Just Rambo III, right? It's not First Blood, Rambo, First Blood Part 3 or anything like that. So Stallone has officially, with this third movie, made the franchise Rambo, right? It's no longer First Blood. It is now officially Rambo. And with this one, he is doing some stick fighting with Harold Diamond in Thailand. He gets approached by Troutman and Kurtwood Smith. They talk about what's happening to the poor, citizens of Afghanistan, and the Russians, and how horrible the Russians are treating them, which is true. The Russians, they killed millions of people in that Afghan war. And Troutman's like, hey, we're going to get them some Stinger missiles, try to turn the tide on this war. I'm going in. I want you to go in with me to bring these Stinger missiles. And Stallone's like, nah, I'm kind of done with that whole thing. I'm happy to just sit here in this Buddhist monastery and bang out some iron and fix the walls and things like that. So Troutman goes, he gets caught, of course, and so then Kurtwood Smith comes back and says, hey, Troutman's been caught, I thought I'd let you know. And Stallone said, what are we going to do about it? And he's like, well, I don't know. I'm not going to do anything. Well, no, I got to go get Troutman. So he goes to the border in Pakistan, meets his handler who gets him over the border to Afghanistan. He starts working with the rebels there, and he meets some people along the way, as you want to do, and learns about the plight of how these people are being treated. He plays a game with a dead sheep where you drag the dead sheep around. So the people respect him and they like him because he's able to play this game with the dead sheep. Again, kind of going back on these themes with Rambo movies. I guess in the previous movie he kills a chicken, right? Because he kills a chicken and the blood sort of makes them think that they're tracking him bleeding. So yeah, back to that theme of killing animals too. He likes, Stallone's not a fan of animals. I guess he likes to treat animals badly. So we're doing that again. But they find out there's a fort where his where Troutman's being held, and of course it's a Soviet guy who's running it there. There's also another big Soviet guy there. One thing I forgot to mention about that previous movie was that you have the big Soviet guy. So it's almost like this idea that Rambo needs somebody to fight, right? And so so with the big Soviet guy there, as a way to show this one man army, there's somebody that can potentially beat the one man army guy. So they go in, and it's just explosion city, right? It's explosive tipped arrows, it's grenades, it's machine guns. He's got AK-47s now, right? Because he's fighting the Russians, and of course the Afghan military. I mean, they get their hands on a lot of AK-47s when they're fighting. It is the number one weapon of rebels is the AK-47, right? It's just it does a lot of what you need it to do. So a lot of explosions, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, it's taking whatever that first movie was and it's making it bigger, but it's making it bigger in Afghanistan. The movie itself, because it's bigger, I mean, I think the budget was like $60 million, and it actually made less than the previous movie. It still makes about over $200 million. It's still a top earner for that year, for 1988. Though, interesting enough, right, another movie that slips in number 10 is Die Hard. And so we kind of get that Willis kind of carves his way in with these other two, with Schwarzenegger and Stallone, to make it a kind of a big three amongst them. He steps in with Die Hard like that, and I think he starts to get bigger roles than Stallone does in the 90s, because again, I think Stallone's reputation kind of hurts him. I mean, this movie, despite it being a top 10 earner, he kind of is done with Rambo for a little bit, because it doesn't do as well as they wanted it to do. I think looking at it from a political standpoint, it is a little bit heavy-handed. There's a scene where he goes into the fort and there's two women being held there, and he's like, I'm an American. Like, that's supposed to be a really great thing. Oh, well, in Afghanistan, it's an American. That's great. They're going to help me. It's like, why do I trust you any more than I trust the Soviet? But Stallone has this idea, well, the Americans are the good guys, right? They're always doing the good things. It's the Soviets that are the bad. So again, this kind of monolithic Soviet baddie kind of thing that, again, at that time was going out of fashion. It wasn't quite what we think it is. Again, we've got Glasnost going on now. We've got Gorbachev signing books with Reagan, to say, hey, we're gonna fix things. We're close to the end of the Soviet Union. We're close to was it 92 that we had, quote, the unified team of essentially all of the Soviet republics that were under the Soviet Union. They all kind of formed together for the Olympics in 92 to work, and then of course it all kind of breaks apart after that, and of course then now you've got Putin trying to bring it all back together by invading everybody, and so and I think that's kind of a thing too, is I think a lot of the countries that border Russia were kind of worried about this, that what's happening with the Ukraine. I think they were all trying to keep Russia happy to do whatever Putin wanted, and I think with the Ukraine, they ended up removing the pro-Putin regime and putting in their own regime, and that's when Putin's like, well, we're invading, but they were all kind of worried that he was going to try to recreate the Soviet Union in that sense. But it's a fascinating thing, right, that you've got Stallone, who's like so ardently anti-Soviet in this movie. Now he's a Trumper hanging out with Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and that makes him, with Trump, they're pro-Putin, right? They like Putin. They like it's an interesting thing, because Putin would be the baddie in any of these 80s movies pretty easily for a lot of the people that like watching these things, who are now fans of Putin and support him. So very fascinating concept that you see that change now, though. I think, when I watch this one now, I mean, the budget is big, right? The explosions are big. It's a fun actioner, but it's also kind of a sense of like, I don't know. I mean, there's sort of that element of the I don't want to say noble savages. I don't know if that's right here. But it does have that feel. It's a thing that we get from Seagal a lot later. This idea of the American who's coming to help out these local villagers and help them fight whatever the baddie is that they've got to fight. And it definitely is true. I mean, they didn't go the route of the quote exotic beauty, close quote. They didn't do that here. There's no woman for Stallone in this, and so maybe he looked at that in the previous one and thought, okay, that's a little bit much. We don't need to do that again. So that's one thing there, right? We don't get that element. I do wonder too if because of maybe he understood some of the realities of the Taliban, and I mean, it wasn't the Taliban at that time, but at least from that part, I don't say like there was at least a sense of like it would have been awkward, right, for him to be hooking up with a woman in a Muslim community like that it might have culturally not looked good. So maybe that was part of it. Like he didn't want to put that kind of thing in there. Maybe he'd done enough research to say, okay, we're not going to do that. Even though the movie is shot in Arizona and stuff like that, they were going to shoot in Afghanistan. But we don't get that trope at least. But I think there was a sense after this movie was done that it didn't do as well, right? It doesn't do as well as the previous one. And I know he had the one more Rocky that he wanted to make. I guess that would have been in 1990 that one comes out. But I think there might have been a sense here like, okay, he's done enough with Rambo. At that time, there wasn't a sense of like, we got to keep making movies. There wasn't a sense of like, I got to make a Rambo 4, 5, 6, and 7. There was more of a sense of, okay, we've made 3 of these. The third one didn't do as well. Let's move on to other projects. And so that's where you start to get things like Demolition Man. You get Judge Dredd. He's doing different things at that time. Again, he makes the one more Rocky movie, then he leaves that for a while. I was trying to think of other stuff he did. We talked about The Specialist, Assassins. Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. I think that one comes around this time, where he's with Estelle Getty. So he's still kind of doing his action stuff. He's still making big movies, but I think he realized, okay, we've done enough Rambo for a little bit. Let's leave it for a bit. And I don't think that's the way we'd think of movies nowadays, right? I think now, if you had a movie a franchise that was successful with the first 2 movies, as the first 2 Rambos were, you had a third one that maybe wasn't as successful, but was still a top 10 earner that year, there would be a sense of either we got to make another movie somehow, we've got to reboot it, right? Bring in somebody new to play the character. Maybe do a branching off, right? Like maybe like have a Troutman series that's direct to streaming. There would be a lot of different things they would do with Rambo that back in 1988, what you do is you just let it sit and you go do some other things. And I think that I kind of appreciate that, because when he does come back in 2008, so 20 years later, he comes back to make that next Rambo movie. There was enough time in between that you had something that was really fun and inspired. And so, this movie, I think there was a sense of like, okay, we've made our third Rambo movie. I think he wanted to correct some of the things that he didn't like about the first movie or the second movie. I think he does enough with that here. By the same token, I mean, explosive tipped arrows blowing up helicopters, you're getting over the top still. It's still cartoonish. I love it. I mean, for me, it's a top 3 exploding helicopter. So my number 1 is Sudden Death. That's just too amazing for words with Powers Booth and the Arita and hockey. I love that so much. Second one is Stone Cold, right? The motorcycle going through the window, smashing up the helicopter. That's a fantastic one. I think that would be my number 1 if Sudden Death didn't have Powers Booth and hockey, right? I just look 2 things that I love. Right? I mean, not just Powers Booth. I think anybody that has a plural first name, that's just so if it had been Wings Hauser instead of Powers Booth, it still would have been amazing for me. So that's always great. But the second one, definitely the Stone Cold one. But this one here, the explosive tipped arrow in the third Rambo, that's my number 3 all time as in terms of exploding helicopters movies. I just love that scene as well. I mean, just a lot of that kind of stuff. I mean, he's just blowing shit up everywhere. So in that sense, as much as he was maybe trying to rectify things he didn't like about the second one, this movie has more of it. Script co-written by Sheldon Lettich, so we know him from working with Van Damme. Great screenwriter there. But I think it's one of those things. I mean, we had James Cameron in the second movie, co-writing that one, and I think James Cameron said, he had ideas for Rambo that Stallone just discarded. He just kind of made it his own movie. I think it's kind of probably what happens here as well. But I think I think it's interesting that Stallone does this, where he says, you know what, I'm going to take a break from Rambo. He could have looked at the 90s and not been getting the successes he wanted in the 90s for movies and said, yeah, where's another Rambo movie? Let's make another Rambo. There might have been other reasons for why he couldn't do it, why it didn't happen. But, he waits until 2008. And, of course, that period in the late 2000s, it seems like everything was getting another sequel, right? Because we talked about this with the Die Hard ones, right? The Die Hard 4 comes out in 2007. The new Indiana Jones movie comes out, I think, in 2008. So, Stallone doing a Rambo movie in '08 felt like it was just another piece of that. But when we get into that one next week, it's going to be a fun one to talk about because I enjoyed that one. I remember watching it with my buddy, and we were both excited by it. So it was my friend Palos, who he may or may not be listening here. But yeah, I remember watching that at his place. We rented it on demand and had a ton of fun with it. So, but this one here, I think, it's interesting. If you're doing a movie night of the first three Rambos, tonally the first one doesn't fit the way that the 2 and 3 do. I think you could do a fun movie night if you just had two movies to do with these two together, 2 and 3. They're both only, I shouldn't say they're both only an hour and a half. The second one here is an hour 41, 42, which it feels like a good hour. It feels longer than the other one. So that is one thing to consider with this one for your movie night, is it stretches out. But one of the things that's good about a movie night is that you get your friends there and you're talking about things. So, while you're discussing things, those extra 10 to 15 minutes that this movie really feels like it has, you won't feel it as much, right? It's not going to get you as much. It is interesting that after this, Stallone doesn't go over an hour and a half for the other ones. I mean, they're all in that hour and a half range for the next two after this. And so this is the only one that really breaches that hour 40-minute mark. And you feel it. You definitely notice it there. It definitely feels longer. But yeah, I think if you and your buddies are doing a nice action movie night, this is a fun one to do. Again, I think this one, the way that the second one solidifies Stallone as an action star, this one it takes a little bloom off the rose for him. And but I think people chalk up the fact that it takes a little bloom off the rose to the fact that they make this movie based on a war that was about to end. They make it based off a baddie who was no longer going to be a baddie, or wasn't really, that it was a tired baddie, but a baddie that really we weren't seeing in society the same way. And so people looked at those things as things that hurt the movie, and that had they gone in different directions in terms of the baddie and the location and all of that kind of stuff, that maybe it would have done better. So he still gets chances into the 90s to try to make things. And again, he has some successes. I think Demolition Man was a success. Judge Dredd, maybe not so much. But he's still a big enough bankable star that this, again, it takes a little bloom off the rose, but it's not enough to kind of fully knock him out the way that the 90s kind of do. And I think maybe for filmmakers or studios that were working with him, they probably saw this as a one-off-ish, iffy one, but probably saw that he still had money in him to be made. I think it would have been interesting if maybe they had looked at this one fully and said, okay, well, why did this one go bad? What were the things that Stallone did to make this? Was it just that he was off on the politics and off on the current events, or were there other things that he was doing? Because I think he starts to do these things more as he gets into the 90s, and it hurts him in terms of being a big bankable star. So we'll see. We'll see what kind of we're gonna take about 20 years off when we come back, and we come back in '08. We'll all be a little bit older. I'm gonna be almost 30 at that point when that was. So I'm 9 years old in 1988. I'm gonna be 29 when we get into 2008. So it's gonna be a big jump for me too when we do that. And then of course we're gonna finish in 2019 when I turn 40. So interesting how I'm 3 years old for the first movie, and I'll be 40 for the last one when we finish this thing off. But yeah, why don't we wrap this up here? So, again, dtvconnoisseur.blogspot.com. That's the site. That's where you can find links to everything. My newest novel, Don's House in the Mountains, you can pick that one up on Kindle, Amazon, a paperback on Amazon, whichever way. I'm still working on getting that getting that novella out, Nadia and Aiden. So I've got to do some more proofreading on that, but hopefully we'll have that one out within the next couple months. So keep an eye out for that as well. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back soon. Bye.